people have got information, evidence as to who took her or where Madeleine is or what's happened to her, we want them to come forward. This is as good an opportunity as there has been at any time in the last 5 years.
We know there's a very good chance that Madeleine's out there and can still be found alive.
But it's alleged that one woman decided to try to convince the McCanns that she was their daughter. Julia Wandel, who is 24 and from Poland, is on trial for stalking them. It's alleged she sent incessant messages to them, even turning up at their house in December 2024. Amaral McCann is now 20 years old, but she was just 2 when her sister Madeleine disappeared on the family holiday in Portugal back in 2007. Now, she appeared at court via video link and alleged that in 2024 she started receiving messages from Julia Wandel. Kate McCann told the court, "I pulled up on the drive. It was really dark. It was the weekend. We had the gales. I was opening the boot to get something out and I heard someone say, 'Kate.' I knew it was someone behind me, but I didn't know who it was. She called me Mum, I think. She was asking for a DNA test. Why won't you do a DNA test?"
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Has anyone noticed in the coverage of the Julia Wandel trial, the Polish woman who claims to be the McCann's long-lost daughter, literally all the photos we see of the McCanns is archival. In this analysis, I want to compare the trials of Julia Wandel with another trial that wrapped up about this time last year, Christian Brueckner. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind, I've written 5 books on this particular case, the Doubt trilogy, as well as Deep into Darkness and Deeper into Darkness, the last 2 books based on me visiting Praia da Luz, a whole boots on the ground research. I'll put links to those books in the description. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please do hit the thanks button. Please consider doing that. And let's get started. Now, I realize trial coverage in the USA is far more public and transparent than in the UK. Certainly in the Lucy Letby case, there was so little that we actually saw. We seldom see television cameras in UK trials, which is one reason why I think you have the Johnny Depp trial becoming a huge circus in the USA, whereas it was totally different, with a totally different outcome in the UK. You may also remember during the recent sentencing of Brian Koberger, his mother and sister were photographed surreptitiously leaving the court through a back entrance. I actually know that court building in Boise quite well, since it's the same court that dealt with the Laurie Vallow case. And I actually travelled there and stayed there and attended trial for a couple of weeks during that case. And so what's plain to see what's been extraordinary in this case, this trial involving 24-year-old Julia Wandel, it's the same thing that has been extraordinary about the Brueckner case, not really the evidence, but the media coverage. I mean, given the type of cases we cover on this channel, this one is relatively mild, stalking. While it's still a crime and obviously unacceptable, it's nevertheless relatively tame compared to what we normally deal with, assassinations, murders and unsolved disappearances, especially of small children. What's been quite extraordinary to observe, and I say this as a photographer, journalist and author that has attended, photographed and observed at least half a dozen cases now in South Africa and the USA, it's been how the British media have covered this case. And I guess what I'm saying is how and what the British media haven't covered and seemingly haven't even tried to cover. Remember, this case is a huge cash cow for them, for the British media, and yet they've been oddly mute in a certain respect in terms of covering this case. I'm not saying there's no coverage. The thing that really stands out is absolutely 0 photos of Kate and Gerry this year. 0 interviews as well. The same doesn't apply to this woman who's co-accused with Julia Wandel. Yeah, we see photos and video of Karen Sprague attending court. Arriving. We also see sketches of the accused sitting in court, but none of the accusers, although I think I've seen one, a sketch of Madeleine's sister, It's been the policy of this channel not to show any photos, not even archival footage, of Madeleine's siblings. Have a look at this headline. Kate McCann tells court of distress over alleged stalkers. Kate and Gerry are a somewhat different kettle of fish, however. During the first months of Madeleine's disappearance, despite being told by the Portuguese police not to engage with the police, it's the policy in a country like Portugal that you don't talk to the media. The police don't talk to the media, and people involved in a particular crime or case don't speak to the media as well because of secrecy laws. Well, despite being told not to engage with the media and not to discuss the case, they actively seem to do so. And this also included Gerry blogging daily about the day-to-day goings-on, going so far to deal with the press that they literally hired PR people. Look at this. Madeleine's search was hijacked by McCann publicity. Of course, all of this chatter, especially online, but also countless interviews and statements pushed out by one PR representative after another, all of this stood in stark contrast to Kate herself refusing to answer any questions when brought in for questioning by the Portuguese police. When the McCanns were first made arguidos in September 2007, 4 months after Madeleine disappeared, they undertook to take polygraphs to clear their name. 5 years later, 15 years later, I'm not sure if it ever happened. Of course, Kate and Gerry McCann have attended trial before and testified in court before. In 2015, that's 10 years ago, we saw very different coverage from the British and international media, and also very different availability for media, photographs, interviews, and press conferences during that time. Do you remember that? Do you remember these images? We saw these sorts of images and headlines crowing about the McCanns winning libel damages against Goncalo Amaral. Have a look at this one. Madeleine McCann's parents win libel damages in trial of police chief. And if you pay careful attention to the dress Kate is wearing in this image outside a Portuguese court from 2015, you can see they actually gave a press conference outside the court on the same day. But you notice we aren't seeing any of that this time round, but more curiously, there seems to be no attempt by the British media to cause offence to the story that has paid them so handsomely. One really has the impression these are their cash cows and they don't want to upset them. Nowhere was this more evident than when the McCanns lost their case against Amaral at Europe's highest court, the European Court of Human Rights. Then there was very little coverage of that. It reminded me of the grand jury indictments in the Ramsey case. You never hear about them. They are never acknowledged. Obviously, the legal import of the McCanns losing their case against Amaral, in other words, the court upheld the lead detective's right to his opinion on what happened to Madeleine, yet the British press once again displayed a talent for being selectively mute in covering it. Google the story of the McCanns losing their libel case and you might find some obscure Scottish paper covering it, like the Scottish Legal News, or El País, a Spanish daily, or the Irish Times, or some American publication like NBC News covering it, or the Brussels Times, a Belgian newspaper. But for all the headlines and print that was spilled covering when the disgraced detective lost, suddenly when it was overturned, they, with few exceptions, lost their tongues and all the cauldrons of ink had suddenly run dry. Now there was suddenly nothing to say about that. Oh, and it's also something that never needs to be brought up in polite conversation either. But returning to the hinky coverage right now, if you look at this image of Kate in a pink dress next to a statement that she made earlier this week, just a few days ago, well, that is actually a photo from a 2012 press conference. That's 13 years ago, where the McCanns showed an age progression image of Madeleine. 13 years ago, they were still pushing the idea that Madeleine could still be alive.
There's a lot changed in the last year, and I think we're more hopeful now of finding Madeleine than we have been at any point since the early days after she was taken, really. That's largely changed with the review, the investigative review being undertaken by the Metropolitan Police.
And it's sort of because of this idea, which I think is open to interpretation, this idea that Madeleine's still alive and well and and safe, and she just doesn't really know that she's Madeleine, but she's out there somewhere. I think it's because of this idea that Julia Wandel was tempted to believe strange things about herself.
It is strange because obviously it's a marker of time. You look at it and it's not Madeleine that we remember. You know, it just emphasises that 5 years have gone by. But I actually feel really positive about that image. I mean, I didn't get upset, I didn't burst into tears.
Imagine in the Gus Lamont case where you reach a point where it's something like 5 years later and Gus is still not being found, and then the parents say on camera, we're in a much better place. Does that make sense? But let's come back to this story. Why are the media using a 13-year-old photo of Kate? She hasn't disappeared. Now think about the coverage of the Brueckner trial in comparison, direct comparison to the Stalker trial. We saw Brueckner repeatedly arriving at court. We saw him inside the courtroom. We saw him leaving the court. We have this coverage in spite of him not only being acquitted on every single charge against him, but he was never even charged in Madeleine's disappearance, and there was never any trial, despite weeks and months and years of the British media bleating about this so-called prime suspect. It's months now since that trial, and you've had the British media, even after his acquittal, and despite no charges, still breathlessly covering his every movement since being released from prison. There's Brueckner caught leaving the prison. Minutes later, Brueckner eating a McDonald's cheeseburger. Brueckner eating a chicken nugget. Brueckner walking across the road. Brueckner seen wearing a hat. Brueckner in a cell phone store. The other interesting thing to note is how much Kate, Gerry and their children, other relatives, even a neighbour, have had to say about Julia, who, let me be clear, I don't think Julia is Madeleine, and I think she has been guilty of stalking. But compare all of that coverage to nary a peep from any of the McCanns when the Brueckner saga was going on. So if you can talk about this stalker in so much detail and with so many people involved, right? Why wouldn't you talk in the same way about Brueckner? Oh, is it to protect the investigation and the secrecy of the investigation? Just the same way the Portuguese said, please don't talk about the investigation. And I guess my point is this. If Brueckner didn't abduct Madeleine, and I don't believe he did, well then the very thing the McCanns are appealing against, testifying against, arguing against, was happening to him for years and is still happening to him. He's being stalked and harassed for something he didn't do. It made me wonder, have the McCanns ever said anything publicly about Christian Brueckner? I mean, they seem to say a lot. Did they ever say anything about him? Did they take any particular interest in the prime suspect in terms of the abduction of their daughter after he was made an official subject, but also during those very high-profile searches in Portugal, including the one that happened just a few weeks ago? Did they say anything about him during the days and days, weeks and weeks, months and years of endless but ultimately unfounded speculation? As far as I know, the McCanns haven't given one interview, haven't given one one-on-one interview talking about Brueckner. And as far as I know, no one even went to question him when he was in prison. The only comment I was able to find wasn't an interview, but was merely a post on their Find Madeleine page, which stated, with very carefully chosen words, posting on the official Find Madeleine campaign Facebook page, Kate and Gerry wrote, "We welcome the news that the Portuguese authorities have declared a German man an arguido in relation to the disappearance of our beloved daughter Madeleine. This reflects progress in the investigation being conducted by the Portuguese, German and British authorities. It is important to note the arguido has not yet been charged with any specific crime related to Madeleine's disappearance. Even though the possibility may be slim, we have not given up hope that Madeleine is still alive and will be reunited with her." Now, who in their right mind would really imagine that someone like Brueckner is being implicated in the disappearance of their daughter, but then Madeleine is still safe and sound? And who in their right mind would say today that was progress in the investigation given where we are right now? In hindsight, would we say the whole Brueckner thing was progress? That anniversary message was posted on April 22nd, 2022, basically, as I say, the annual message remembering Madeleine a week prior to the anniversary of her disappearance. If you read between the lines, you'll see they don't even mention Brueckner by name. And why is that? Well, I would say it's due to legal caution. And during the last 3 years, with all the chatter of the prime suspect about to stand trial, did the McCanns offer any comment, any thoughts, any insight, any advice? Although the McCanns didn't participate in the media narrative during the Brueckner saga, many would have assumed their silence to be a kind of consent, especially given the statement referring to the investigation into him as progress. How different the silence was compared to when there were suspicions swirling around them and the Tapa 7. And then there's also this. Do you remember what the former lead detective Goncalo Amaral said before the fact? Way before the brouhaha against Brueckner erupted in 2020, Amaral predicted Brueckner would be made a scapegoat. Predictably, this wasn't covered by the British media, but in Australian media. Look at this. Maddie prime suspect just a scapegoat, former lead Portuguese detective claims. Yet 3 weeks later, the McCann's Portuguese lawyer did offer this rare response. And this response from the McCann's quote-unquote close friend, that's according to the article, was published in British media. McCann's Portuguese lawyer calls ex-police chief's claim about German investigation fantasy, and that was a direct reference to Brueckner. Brueckner himself felt that he was a scapegoat. Was he right? Or were the McCanns right? Do you think declaring Brueckner an Arguido was progress? Do you think any of the Arguidos that have been declared was progress, starting with Robert Murat? Because it's a very curious turn of phrase, this, when you think about this case and the Ramsey case, because the Tanner sighting turned out to be fantasy. Brueckner, who we're told unambiguously here is the reality, also turns out to be legal fantasy. In the Ramsey case, the no snow story is fantasy along with so much else, in terms of the intruder theory. It does rather beg the question, what is reality? And is Julia's obvious flight from reality so very different from the almost farcical obsession with Brueckner in the British media? What is the real reality of this case?
While it remains a burden assiduously avoided, it is not unexpected and thus not beyond a measure of control, which has led you inexorably here.
You haven't answered my question.
Quite right.
Are all these unanswered questions unanswered by design? What do you think? Well, I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.